All right, here we are for the Normans, and tonight we're going to talk about the Norman Papal Alliance in various manifestations. I'm going to talk somewhat about the Norman Church in Italy and Sicily, and I'm also going to talk about the kinds of building campaigns that the Normans did in Italy and Sicily. And I'm going to expand quite a bit. I don't have quite as full notes this time as I did before, so I want to invite you all to ask questions if you have any questions about the kinds of things I'm going to ask you. Before I start, there seems to be a problem with the website that some people are saying the lecture notes aren't on there, and I tried to access it yesterday and couldn't, so I don't know, but I'll check as soon as I can tomorrow and see what the situation is. Anyway, they're all on my computer, so I can reload them if something's happened to them. All right, we're going to look at the Norman Papal Alliance, and from 999 to the 1130s. How is that? Is that okay? From 999 until the 1130s, the Normans started to drift into southern Italy. But the Normans weren't the only ones who were going on pilgrimages to Rome. One of the really extraordinary things about this period is people were going to Rome from virtually every country in northern Europe, and especially the Scandinavians and the Normans and the English. A lot of people were going to Rome. There were a lot of notable pilgrimages to Rome. Remember that King Canute of England went to Rome in 1035. Robert the Pious, who was the father of William the Conqueror, actually died on pilgrimage. He went to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, but he went by way of Rome. The Beck monks, William Bona Anima and Gundulf, who later became Bishop of Rochester in England, went to Jerusalem before 1060. And Lanfranc of Bec, of course, went to Rome in 1051, and John Abbot of Fécamp went to Rome in 1053. And so you have a lot of travelers. Everybody's on the road traveling around. So it's not extraordinary that these Normans were setting out on a journey and going through Italy to Jerusalem. It is kind of interesting that they were going overland, because remember the Vikings, we think of them as going by ships, but by this time the Normans had been in Normandy for 100 years, and now they're more accustomed to going overland. And so among these pilgrims to that area were the 12 sons of Tancred d'Hauteville, and the most famous of these were Robert Guiscard and William Bras de Fer, who, that's William Ironarm is his name, and we might note that these nicknames that they have remind us in a way of Viking nicknames, of Viking habits of naming people by nicknames. Richard of Aversa was also another of these Normans not related to the sons of Tancred d'Hauteville, who married Fredesendis, sister of Robert Guiscard. So he was related by marriage, but not necessarily as part of that family. Anyway, the Normans were all connected together. And you know, I just might mention something as we're looking here. Here's the map showing the routes to Jerusalem, and I might mention something about that's interesting in this period. In Normandy and in England and in Italy and Sicily and in France as well, and I'm not as sure, I don't know as much about Germany, but this is the time when last names began in Europe. Before this time, people didn't have last names. They sort of went by the name that they had. And so we're seeing the generation of these last names, which might have been part of the impact of the Vikings on there, because the Vikings so often named children after their fathers. Ericsson, for example, Leif Erikson was the son of Eric, and often they would have the names of in England, they would be named after their father, and you'd have someone named, for example, Roger Fitzwilliam, who would be Roger, the son of William. And we see this happening all over in this area, and so they're getting last names for the first time. Yeah.
I think you're right that the Normans did play a major part in it because they were very unimaginative. They kept using the same names for a great many people living, and so they had to have some way to tell them all apart.
You notice that, yeah, they all have the same names, and so that's true. You did have to
men and women.
Men and women, yes. We were joking about the Matildas in England. All the queens of England were named Matilda. But so many people are named William and Roger and Robert, and there aren't that many Norman names that are really used by everybody around there. Well, here is our map that shows the kind of journey that they would have made, and let's see if I have a pencil here. Oops. Well, of course, I don't have one that's easy to get hold of. There, okay. So that they would have gone from Normandy, and then they would have gone, probably the most popular way of going was this way through Burgundy and then over the Alps. And there's the St. Bernard Pass is right here. That would have been the easiest way to get across the Alps, and then down overland through Tuscany and then on to Rome, and then this way the route to the Holy Land. This way would have been the most common way to go on these pilgrimages. A lot of change was taking place in Europe at this very time. We talked about the last names. People all of a sudden wanted last names, needed last names to be identified. Why is this? You know, it's quite curious. One of the things that we see in Normandy is a pattern of family identification. Suddenly families are really, really important in identifying the various members of those families, and that may have something to do with the development of last names. Yeah.
What about title to land? You would need to identify people specifically.
Titles to land, yes, you would need to identify them, and this also may be part of a more general transition that's going on in Europe at this time that is getting a lot of study right now, and this is, it's characterized by Tom Clancy, who wrote this book called From Memory to Written Record. From Memory to Written Record, and let me just write that down. And this is a book that is about England. It's largely about England, and it's about the transition from an oral culture to a written culture, and all of the psychological and cultural changes that take place because people are making that transition. When you go from a culture where you have to memorize everything and you have to remember everything, such as the Vikings. The Vikings, of course, memorized all their law codes. Nothing was written down, and the law speaker recited 1/3 of the law code every year. In England, laws were remembered by oral means. And the holding of land grants, usually in the courts, you would have witnesses who would testify to who owned the land from their memory, not owned the land, but held the land. And in the time of the Normans, the transition takes place to the using of written records, charter evidence, and charters just multiply and explode everywhere, so that may have been part of it. This is very important because, for one thing, it may have something to do with the explosion of historical writing that we see at this time, that suddenly everybody wanted to write it all down. And this is happening just at this time, and so it makes a big impact on the culture of the Normans wherever they went. Yeah, comment.
I'm wondering if the production of historical record is also partly to commemorate some families and their deeds, and maybe that elevates their status in society?
It would, and this goes along with that other form of writing that's going on at this time, saints' lives. the writing of the lives of saints. And actually, Tom Clancy doesn't talk about that. He deals with legal documents in that book. But the lives of saints are being written and rewritten at this time. And this is something I didn't mention when we looked at early Normandy, that there was a graduate student who now has her PhD. She was at Harvard a few years ago, and what she did was study the saints' lives that were being written in Normandy, especially on the frontiers of Normandy, around the area of the Cotentin and the Avranchin. And she discovered that they had lost all memory of the actual lives of those saints, and that they were reinvented. They invented new lives that were stories of conversion. And her theory was that these lives were being written in the time of the Normans to urge the Normans to help them convert to Christianity. I mean, it was quite a brilliant thesis that she had. I can bring her name next time if anybody wants to look up her work. But that is extremely interesting. So that's a huge trend that's going on at this time. So we've got the formulation of last names, and so identifying people more precisely at this time. We've got the switch from oral to written records going on at this time. And we've got the rise of the Reformed papacy. Up to this time, the papacy had been kind of in abeyance. It had been almost somnolent, asleep, and the popes had not tried to assert any power. The only pope who really had tried to assert power was Pope Sylvester II, who was pope around the year 1000. He's easy to remember. His date is easy to remember. He actually died in 1002. And he began a very slow and small movement of organizing people around northern France and Italy in connection with the Ottonian emperors. And he worked with the Ottos, Otto I, Otto II, and Otto III, who had imperial ambitions, and they were the ones who really formed the basis of the Ottonian Empire, the German Empire. And so Pope Sylvester II, and let me write his name down here because he precedes these popes, was especially connected with the Archbishop of Reims. And the Archbishop of Reims was the traditional person who crowned the French king. And Reims at that time was fairly independent of the French king, though the Archbishop of Reims claimed the right to crown the French king, but the French king had no power over him at all because his domain was so small. We've already talked about that, and most of France was independent at that time. And so Pope Sylvester II was able to pull together just a very small element of papal activists who were trying to strengthen the power of the papacy. And then it falls into abatement for a while. Sylvester worked with the Ottonian emperors, but when he died, there was a series of weak popes, and they were all appointed by the German emperors, and they were very weak, and they didn't assert their power at all. They didn't even try to. Until the time of getting into the 1140s, really. And then you have a period of rivalry between the citizens of Rome, who were asserting their right to choose the Pope, against the power of the emperor to appoint the Pope. And before Pope Leo IX, who's usually thought of as the first of the Reformed popes, before Pope Leo IX, there were actually 3 popes in Rome, and all in the same year, and they all died mysterious deaths. Okay, and it looks to me, it all looks very fishy, and it looks like the sources are covering up what really happened to them. But Bruno, Bishop of Toul, who was a German who then took charge and actually launched a campaign to make himself Pope. He lobbied the emperor to appoint him. He rallied the people of Rome to acclaim him as Pope, and he sought the papacy very actively. And once he got to be Pope, he started holding councils throughout Europe, and the first place he went to hold a council was in Reims. And there was a great school at Reims, which was a place that was very independent of French rule or imperial rule or anybody's rule. The Roman citizens had no control over it, and that is where Leo IX chose to go to have his first council. And at that council in 1049, he proclaimed a lot of reforms for the church. One of the reforms he proclaimed was that clerics no longer would be able to be married. There was a lot of marriage of clerics at that time, and he proclaimed this was against the rules of the church. Simony, the buying and selling of offices, was outlawed. And so let me write some of those things. Marriage of clerics, simony, and also some other things we've talked about before, the investiture of clerics by laymen, and the doing of homage by clerics to laymen. This was the very first time that was outlawed, and so it was a whole program of reform. Yeah, question?
I thought that marriage within the clergy had been outlawed at the Council of Nicaea. I thought they had decided even then that the clerics shouldn't get married. Is he just enforcing this more strongly?
Well, yeah, but that was a long time ago, and the Roman Church had totally collapsed in that time, and all the churches were completely independent. And this is a period when the papacy is starting to rebuild a kind of central power that had not existed for 500 years. And so, yes, in a way, he's restoring rules that had been there a long time ago. But there were new rules he was passing. For example, investiture and homage was something utterly new, because that has to do with feudalism, and there was no feudalism at the Council of Nicaea. It didn't exist in that time. And so it's this combination of old rules he's putting back in force and new rules that he is adopting to suit the nature of the times. Yeah.
But doesn't this lead to actually a break with the Eastern Church where celibacy was not acceptable?
It eventually did, yeah. And in fact, 1054 is one of the dates that is accepted as a break between the Western and the Greek Church, yeah.
You said that prior to Leo IX, the popes in Rome, there were mysterious deaths.
Yes.
Mabel of Boleyn wasn't in town, was she?
No, she wasn't. That I know of, yeah. Yeah, but I mean, clearly there's violence going on. I mean, there's violence going on in Rome. There are riots in the street. And Leo IX brings this peace, and he does it by going to Reims and passing these new laws. And in Reims, of course, the Archbishop is there. There's a big school there, and it's the center of a movement of reform. Well, big things are happening in Europe at that time. The following year, 1050, Robert Guiscard married Aubrey of Buonoberga, and so he started on his great career of making his power grow in Italy. The very next year, 1051, William the Bastard married Matilda of Flanders, and so we see alliances being formed, lay alliances. The popes, first starting with Leo, saw the Normans as a threat. They saw the Normans as a threatening barbarian power that was about to overrun the papal lands, and so they raised a papal army. And I have never been able to find out who was in that army and where they got their forces, but they did lead an army against the Normans. The Normans then defeated them at the Battle of Civitate and took Pope Leo IX prisoner at this time. On 23 June, the Normans took Leo to Benevento, and by 1054, on 19 April, Leo died. And at this time, the great peacemaker arose, Desiderius of Monte Cassino, to become Pope Victor II. And it was really Desiderius of Monte Cassino who recognized the possibility of how the papacy could use these Normans, who were very malleable and opportunistic, to use them to build the power of the papacy. Yeah, question?
In the library is a book called Warfare in Feudal Europe. Mm-hmm. It gives a pretty reasonable breakdown of the strength and the composition of both armies in that battle in one of the chapters.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'll have to look that up. I'd really like to see what was in that army. But Desiderius of Monte Cassino is one of the major players in this period. Here is a picture, again, from St. Angelo Informus of the bishops and monks of the time, and we might just zoom in on this beautiful fresco on the wall of these bishops and monks who would have been the churchmen at this very time we're talking about. And here is our map of Italy, where we're seeing Monte Cassino up here, just on the boundary of the Norman territory, just over the boundary near Rome and near the first Roman areas of Gaeta and Amalfi over here, and Aversa and Capua, where the Normans are active, Richard of Aversa being one of the first ones in that area. And let's recall that Apulia and Calabria, well, Apulia was the area of Robert Guiscard. This was the area of Richard of Aversa. And later this becomes the area where Roger, who was to become the great count, the youngest brother of Robert Guiscard, was active in this area. Okay. From 1057 to 1058, Frederick of Monte Cassino became Pope Stephen IX. Sometimes he's called Pope Stephen X. He was the brother of Godfrey the Bearded, Duke of Lower Lorraine and Count of Tuscany, in right of his wife Beatrice, Countess of Tuscany. And so this family became the major supporters of the Reformed papacy against the emperor, and it was the armies of Tuscany that were sent out against the kings of Germany. Yeah, question?
Where does the confusion about whether he's the 9th or the 10th arise from?
It's the way you count the popes, and I'm not sure where that is at all. And I've read it both ways, and the latest authors I've looked at call him Stephen the Ninth. Yeah.
So what happened to Desiderius?
He only lived a couple of years, and then he died, a natural death, unusual at this time.
Name is Pope Desiderius?
Desiderius was Victor II, I believe. I had that written down. Let's see. I believe it was only Pope 2 years. He wasn't known very well, but he was far more important as a person. Yes, he was Pope Victor II. He was far more important than the 2-year papacy would indicate, because he was the one who really was instrumental in bringing the Normans under the papal power. Then we have a lot of confusion in the papacy. Again, from 1058 to 1059, Pope Benedict X was pope, and he was actually an appointee of the emperor, and he was then deposed, and the reformed Pope Nicholas II became pope from 1058 to 1061. These popes didn't reign such a short time because they were being murdered. It was because they were old when they became pope, and most of them died a natural death. They ruled a very short time, but each one was very important. In that very year that Pope Nicholas II took the throne, Robert Guiscard repudiated his wife Aubrey and married Sigelgaita, sister of Gisulf, the Lombard prince of Salerno, and it was purely trumped up. And their son, then, Bohemond, instantly became an illegitimate child. And so even though they had been married previously, so he was an illegitimate child. In that very year, too, Richard of Aversa became Prince of Salerno, Prince of Capua, and Desiderius became Abbot of Monte Cassino in 1058. So we're going a little bit backward in time here. And here is the genealogy, which is also on the website of the counts of Lorraine, the counts of Lorraine on this side, Godfrey, Count of Lorraine here, and Godfrey the Bearded, who married Beatrice of Bar, and the counts of Tuscany here, and the counts of Upper Lorraine and Lower Lorraine over here. Okay. This is a picture of Abbot Desiderius, a very beautiful picture of him. This is a fresco on the wall of his church that he ruled before he ruled Monte Cassino, which was St. Angelo in Formis, which we'll come back to a bit later. And this is the scene in Aversa, that territory that the Normans first became strong in. This is what the countryside looked like in Aversa. The Treaty of Melfi, of course, was in 1058 to 1059, and immediately thereafter there was a Council of Rome in which decrees for free papal election were declared. In August, there was the Synod of Melfi, and Richard of Aversa was now recognized as Prince of Capua, and Robert Guiscard was now recognized as Duke of Apulia and Calabria. And both of these Normans promised to defend free papal elections, and both became papal vassals. They actually did homage to the Pope. Nicholas then granted Sicily to Robert, God's will permitting, and Count Robert, and so he granted Sicily even though Roger hadn't conquered it yet. So he granted him the right to conquer Sicily and finished the conquest of Apulia and Calabria, which he hadn't completed yet at that time. Yeah, question?
How similar is this to having the papal banner in 1066 in the north?
Excellent. Exactly the same thing. And Nicholas didn't grant the papal banner, Alexander did, but now the tradition is started, and so the idea of patronizing the Normans and having them as their vassals is growing among the reformed popes to strengthen their power. Count Roger then was established at Mileto, Rosanna, Cosenza, and Geras, and they submitted to the Normans, and the Normans then attacked Reggio and Squillace. And here we can see where those areas are. What Roger was doing was really conquering this area of Basilicata and Calabria, which had, and here are all these towns I just mentioned to you, which were previously under the control of the Byzantines. And so he is building his power and his control in this area. This is where the Aversa Normans were, and these are Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger working in this area. Okay. In 1060, there's another Reformed Council of Rome, and at that point, Robert Guiscard seized Taranto, and Roger the Great Count, who was later to be called the Great Count, made his first raids on Sicily, and the Normans occupied Reggio and Scylla. In 1061, in February, Robert raided Sicily with Ibn al-Timna, who is what? A Muslim. He's allying with Muslims, and he doesn't care who his allies are, whoever makes him win. So Robert raids Sicily with Ibn al-Timna, and in May, Roger and Robert Guiscard captured Messina. But in 27 July, Nicholas II died, and a momentous change for the Normans in England happened because Pope Alexander II, who had been Anselm of Baggio, a student of Lanfranc at Bex, then became Pope. And the very first thing that happened was the Emperor of Germany appointed an anti-pope, and Pope Alexander was thrown out of Rome. Well, he called on his vassals, the Normans, and they restored him to Rome. A Norman army put Alexander back in Rome, led by Robert Guiscard. In 1066, on 5 January, Edward the Confessor died, and in 6 January, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England. And at that point, Pope Alexander granted the papal banner to William the Bastard to conquer England. Yeah, question.
When the anti-pope was throwing him out of Rome, did the anti-pope have the support of the Roman populace?
At this point, the Roman populace is powerless because they are out of the struggle. Originally, they had been part of the struggle with the emperors on who was going to appoint or acclaim the pope. Now, at this point, the battle has shifted to a struggle between the German emperor and the Normans. And so the Roman citizens are relatively powerless. They're pawns in the whole thing.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean they can't rise up in street rioting or demonstrations to support this faction or that faction.
As far as I know, they're not doing it at this point. It's really a struggle between the Normans and the Germans. And there's the Germans are consistently appointing a rival pope and supporting him, and Rome keeps changing hands. In fact, Rome is ravaged by these armies, and so the citizens really have no power. They have no control. Yeah.
What is interesting is why William is not interested in becoming an emperor eventually in the next following years, just like the Germans used to be.
Oh, William the Conqueror? Yeah. I think even William was not quite that daring and blatant, but he certainly had thoughts of controlling a huge amount of land, and he was content to be just the king, though. Content to be the king. That is an interesting comparison. Well, let's kind of look at these areas that the Normans have gotten control of. Scylla, right down here, and Reggio, which is right across the straits, and they're attacking Messina, which is across the straits into Sicily. So they're already making inroads, and meanwhile, Robert Guiscard has grabbed Taranto up here, strengthening his power everywhere. And here is that area of Calabria, where Roger was strengthening his power. This is in that same area. And there we see Sicily right off the straits of right across the straits of Messina that the Normans would have seen as they looked over there. Well, at this point, we see the beginning of the creation of the Norman Italian church and state. The Norman explorers had gone to Spain and Italy. 40 Normans had arrived in Capua and hired out as mercenaries. Large Norman groups had gone to Rome, and Pope Benedict the Ninth had sent them to attack Apulia. In 1017, and attacking Apulia meant attacking the Byzantines. In 1017, Meles of Apulia hired Ralph of Tony and sent recruiters to Normandy. And pilgrims coming from Italy reported Italy to Normandy. And here again is that progress here. And here I've run through a summary of the conquest of Sicily. We've already actually gone through that, so I'm going to sort of skip through it. Here's the Battle of Civitate. Again, Pope Leo IX was imprisoned, and Roger, the youngest son of Tancred d'Hauteville, arrived. The Norman conquest was then in full swing by 1054 to 1058. The Normans of Aversa spread northward to Gaeta, Aquino, and Capua, and Robert Guiscard spread his conquest in Calabria and Apulia. We've already talked about Guiscard repudiating Aubray in the Treaty of Melfi. Nicholas II received Richard and Guiscard as vassals and Richard as Prince of Capua. Guiscard was Duke of Apulia and Calabria by the grace of God and St. Peter, and with their help in the future, Duke of Sicily. Okay, so here are these ambitions to conquer not only all of Italy, but Sicily as well. Now I want to go through a kind of visual record of the impact of the Normans. And one of the really, really interesting things I learned as I traveled through this area of Italy and Sicily during spring break was that Italy is just like England. It was so extraordinary. Remember we talked about the conquest of England and how the Normans leveled all the existing churches, and in every town and village and city of England, it's dominated by a Norman church and a Norman castle. Italy is exactly the same way. Everywhere the Normans went, they built castles, and you see castles at every city, and every city has a Norman church. Apparently, they tore down the old churches just as they did in England. At least none of them survived to this day, whereas a lot of Norman churches survived. They've been much more altered in Italy than they have in England, but they still are there. And in fact, they're not in the guidebooks, and there aren't any books published about them. And so a lot of our traveling around was just going to Norman towns and walking around the towns and finding the Norman churches because they weren't in the guidebooks. This is very extraordinary, and I want to give you an idea of how the Normans built churches all over this area of Italy and Sicily. And here is our view of the area of Aversa, again, that area around Capua and Aversa, and this is what the land looks like. It's very rich and cultivated land in this area. These are lemon groves down here, and this is farmland and the town in the distance. This picture is taken from the major church in that town that dominates the whole area. It's taken from the church of St. Angelo in Formis, looking out over the countryside. And the countryside is dominated by this huge church up on a high hill. But then, even though the church is already on a high hill, when you look out past the church, you see on another higher hill that's even higher the Norman castle that dominates the land. And we actually could not get to that castle, but here you can see it perched on top of this hill. And it's a hill side by side with this hill on which is the church of Monte Cassino. Here is not Monte Cassino, but St. Angelo in Formis. Here is another view of a castle on a hill, and this is very typical of a Norman castle and where it would be on a hill. This is, I'm trying to remember where this is. Oh, this is in Amalfi. This is in Amalfi, which the Normans took. And so this is very typical of a Norman castle on a hill, the way it would dominate the whole countryside. There appears to be another one right over here. Yeah.
I mean, it does seem to dominate the countryside, certainly, but its placement, it seems almost strategically unsound, because, yes, it's too steep to attack, but it looks almost too steep to attack from as well.
It does, but this is exactly how the Normans built their castles, all over Normandy and all over England. If there was no hill, they built an artificial one called a Motte and Bailey Castle. They built an artificial hill, a mound, to put that castle on.
Well, a hill itself, it's just the hills in Italy seem to be so steep that...
Yes.
How did they get the supplies up there, never mind, getting an army out of there?
Your guess is as good as mine. I mean, as I traveled around, I was just dumbfounded to see the rigors of the countryside and what a difficult kind of country it was. And imagining those Normans riding around there and building their castles up on the hill, it would be so difficult to attack. Can you imagine an army galloping up that hill? I mean, for the first thing, you could see it coming from miles away and ambush them. Yeah.
I wonder if the Italian traditions of building that went back to Roman times was still alive in the days when the Normans arrived.
Yes,
the civil engineering capabilities.
The answer is no, the civil engineering capabilities. Okay. The answer is partially, yes, because the building of bridges was still going on in medieval times, and they used Roman bridges as models. But imagine, I mean, you didn't have to cart the stone very far because all of Italy was very stony. I mean, there's a lot of stone around to build these stone castles, so you don't have to worry about that. In Normandy, they... pardon?
dig your foundation, and there you have your walls.
Right, dig your foundation and you have your walls. Yeah, comment?
Your biggest problem of defense in a situation like that is water supply, because it makes it far more difficult to sink a well for the castle. Insofar as getting the supplies up there, that's not that difficult when you consider the huge numbers of mules they have up there, and they are excellent at going up steep slopes. Insofar as the horsemen coming out of there charging down, they made sure that the roads were built in such a way as to allow that. The Normans used their castles as bases.
Yeah, they did.
But insofar as supply, it's not all that difficult.
And they're quite small. Notice how small these castles are. I mean, you're not talking about hundreds of people living in the castle. You're talking about 20 guys, you know, with their horses and their servants. And you're not talking about huge numbers of people. But with a castle like this on this kind of a hill, you can control the whole countryside from that kind of a vantage point. And the Normans built churches in every single town. Every town we went to, every Norman town, there were Norman churches, and they weren't in the guidebooks, as I said. But here they are. They're 12th century, or they're 11th and 12th century churches, and the very earliest ones, this is in Aversa, they're very, very simple and plain. And as time went by, they got more and more complicated and complex and decorated. But the very oldest ones were absolutely plain like this. Yeah, comment.
Are there very early Benedictine monasteries around Monte Cassino that they didn't replace?
That's an interesting question. No, there weren't that many. There were only a few monasteries. The Normans actually founded a lot of monasteries in Italy. And I'll get to that as I go along, the founding of monasteries. Yeah.
With that photograph you showed with that church, how do you distinguish between Norman architecture and Romanesque?
Norman architecture is Romanesque. I mean, it's Norman Romanesque, okay? Romanesque means pre-Gothic. It means using Roman architectural elements, but combining them in quite a different way than the Romans did. You've got Roman arches. You've got Roman stories to the building. This is the bell tower. I'll show you that. This is medieval. It's a rose window, and then you've got these arches and the repeated arches, which is strictly medieval. The Romans didn't do that. But Romanesque means you take Roman elements and you combine them in new ways. Okay? Gothic is an utterly different kind of architecture. This is clearly Romanesque. This is the front door, and this is the bell tower. And the streets were so narrow in Aversa that I had to take this church in pieces. Okay, here's the front door again, and this is the little side area, the side door here, and here's the bell tower. And then here you can see the bell tower in its entirety. But there was a tiny little square in front of this church, and the streets were so narrow that in many cases they were only wide enough for one car to go down them, and they're like rabbit warrens. I mean, all of these cities in Italy are so archaic. They're medieval. They're still medieval in their makeup, and you can walk through the cities and you find medieval buildings, and you find in the side of a building Norman windows and Norman walls suddenly have not been changed, and there they are in a medieval building. I'll show you some of those later, but they're just incredible. And so here was this church in Aversa, clearly Norman Romanesque of a very early period. We couldn't find out anything about it. We couldn't get in. Here is the back side of it, okay, which had been kind of whitewashed. Here it comes back. The front is over here that I've already shown you, and it goes straight back, and then here's the apse back here, and this is clearly Norman. And so this is from the original Norman church, and Norman Romanesque, classic Norman Romanesque from the early period. Here is another of these castles on the hill. This is a castle in Amalfi up here. There's a castle on this hill, and there's a castle on this hill. This is all new, of course, but you can see the hills and the lay of the land. And then here, this is in Ravello, which is also kind of near Amalfi on that same coast, and Ravello was a Norman city. And we were just walking around and looking down the hill, and here is this extraordinary Norman church. And it has a Norman bell tower, a round bell tower, and this is over the crossing. And that's typical of the churches in England. You always have a tower over the crossing, and here is a Norman church with a tower over the crossing. And then we walked down to this church, and we couldn't get in, and we couldn't even peek into the door. But it's a Norman church. It's just an incredible one. There was nobody to ask. It was locked. I mean, it was just locked, and so we couldn't get in. But as you look down the hill, now look over here to the left, there's going to be another Norman church, and I'll show it to you in the next picture. There it is. Here's the edge of that church with the round bell tower, and then here is another classic Norman church down here. We did go down to that church and look into we were able to look into the door, and I stuck my camera in there and I took some pictures of the interior, but when I put them on a disc and brought them to school, I had messed it up, so I'll have to show you the interior of that church next week. But I do have a shot of the interior of that church, and it's a classic Norman church. And this is two churches right next to each other in Ravello, along the coast. This is the Norman Cathedral in Ravello, and this is a classic Norman bell tower, classic Norman arches that you see in Normandy and in England, the same kind of design. Here is the main church right over here. This is a cathedral where a bishop would have been. And inside this church, there's not much left inside this church of Norman things. The shell of the building is there, and they've sort of ripped out all the Baroque stuff that replaced the Norman stuff, and they whitewashed it all with white walls. So it's a pure white church inside. But inside, there are remnants of the Norman times, and this pulpit is a magnificent remnant of the Norman times. It's clearly Norman, and it has this classic Norman mosaic design that you see all over Italy in all the Norman churches. Mosaic design here, these kinds of birds here. Can anybody guess what these pictures are? No, they're not dragons. Do you want me to zoom in on them so you can see them real closely? Because I want to see what you think they are. Let me see if I can get that one on that side. All right. They're not dogs. What is the story in the Bible where someone gets swallowed? Jonah and the whale. That's what it is. It's Jonah and the whale. And this is a Norman idea of what a whale looks like. And he's swallowing Jonah whole. Okay, now let's see if we can shift over and see the other side of the picture. Okay, there he's regurgitating him.
Dr. Vaughn?
Yeah.
But I thought the Scandinavians knew what whales look like. Didn't they hunt whales?
But these Normans are now maybe 4 or 5 generations removed from their Scandinavian origins. They've forgotten.
So they stopped
now,
those types of fishing?
In England, they knew what whales looked like because they still were harvesting beached whales, and they were claiming them as food and use for the blubber. But in Italy, they didn't know anymore. Apparently, this is 12th century, so it would have been a century later than the first Normans coming to this area, but this is the oldest thing that survives. And here you can see these wonderful birds. Let's see if I can maybe focus those a little. Ooh, yeah. So, see these birds that are decorations, and this is the kind of decorations that we were just so excited to see, this wonderful pulpit that was clearly 12th century and clearly so Norman in feeling, and nobody knew. I mean, we didn't know it was there. It wasn't in any of the guidebooks or anything, and so at least not the English ones. And so we found this incredible altar in the middle of this church. And yeah, question.
I think the stylized rendering of the whale is probably mixing up the story of Jonah and the whale with the rendition of Job and the Leviathan in the book of Job, because in the book of Job, the Leviathan is regarded as scaled and everything else.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, it could be that. It could be that. We just assumed it was Jonah and the whale, but it could be the Leviathan. That's an interesting bit of speculation as far as identifying that. I just loved it. I thought it was so wonderful. And here in the crypt, there were lots of remnants, little bits and pieces that were left from the original Norman church. You all know what the crypt is? It's underneath. It's kind of like a basement to the church that's underneath the church. And here is another wonderful little Norman dragon that was left over, this kind of mosaic. Now, this mosaic that is done is Byzantine. It would have been Byzantine, and Byzantine workmen would have done it, and it would have been done in the Byzantine tradition to do any kind of designs in mosaic. Yeah.
Parts of this look Islamic Persian also. I don't know why.
They do, and remember this is in Ravello, which is right near Amalfi, and there were a lot of incursions on that coast by the Saracens from Sicily who invaded repeatedly in that area and were repelled by the local inhabitants. But sometimes the Saracens would come and they would capture an area and stay there for a while. And so it's not surprising that it would have a kind of Saracen feel to it, a Muslim feel to it, because Norman art, as it developed, is a blend of Romanesque and ancient Roman and Byzantine and Muslim, and we see that time and time again. I'll show you some other altars that you'll see that are extremely Muslim in their design, Arabic. Now here are some capitals that are pure Norman Romanesque that were in the crypt. They were saved in the crypt. And you can see this beautiful carving, and some of it is whimsical. It's very funny and amusing, and it's very comic and grotesque, but in a comic kind of way that is very typical of what the Normans do in the Norman Romanesque capitals. And I'll show you some more of those later, but these are the earliest ones. I'm trying to isolate the very earliest work for you to show you what the earliest ones would have done. And here's another of these capitals. I showed you this last time. Here is that archer I showed you, and here are some other figures that are on this capital that is preserved from Norman times. And this is my favorite. I love this one. It's some kind of a lion or a beast, and this is in a villa, the Norman villa that's right next to the cathedral in Ravello. And this is probably later. It's probably 13th century, but it's a wonderful, whimsical kind of Romanesque beastie that has a great sense of humor. I mean, all of these things have wonderful, amusing characteristics to them. It's a lion apparently biting a wolf or a dog. And one of the things that is extremely extraordinary about all this art in southern Italy, this Norman art, is the number of lions. There are just huge numbers of lions. There are motifs with lions everywhere. And next week I'll show you more. I just didn't have time to print out all the lions. But this is one of the neatest ones. I really like this stylized lion. I think it's very beautiful in the villa that's next door. And now, last time I ended by telling you that, showing you Abbot Desiderius's church in St. Angelo in Formis. And as I was collecting all this art and getting it all together, it appeared to me that St. Angelo in Formis and this particular church of St. Angelo served as a model church that was then copied all over the Byzantine world. And I'll show you some, not Byzantine, but Norman world. And I'm going to carry on that theme. I want you to remember my premise here as we go through the Church of St. Angelo in Formis. And try to keep it in mind. I'll show you the pictures again when we get to other things to compare them to. But what I think is that it served as the model for the rest of the Norman churches that were made both in Italy and Sicily. And by some kind of a miracle, this church is preserved almost intact in its original state. And I want to show you what this church looks like. Here is the entrance as we go in, and there's a kind of forecourt here with arches, Roman arches. And these are even sort of horseshoe arches. It's a Roman basilica type church with a high nave in the middle and two side aisles, which you can read on the outside as you go in here. And this is classic Roman Christian church from the early Christian church. It's a classic basilica style, and this is the exterior of St. Angelo in Formis. As you come to the front door, there is a fresco of an angel. This is probably Michael over the tympanum. Let's see if we can maybe read that inscription. I don't know if we can read it or not. Probably not. Not clear enough. Okay. I think this was one of the churches built by the Normans. It was sponsored by the Normans. And I'm not finding the exact phrase there for you. And then we have another mosaic across the top. I didn't show you all the mosaics, but they're all in that porch that's filled with, not mosaics, but frescoes in the whole porch. Now here we go to the inside of the church, and this is a classic Roman basilica that would have been made as an early Christian church was made. Here's the central nave, and we have two side aisles on each side. Here is the altar right here with the apse and no windows, and it's classic Romanesque because there are hardly any windows at all in it. It has a wooden ceiling, the kind of wooden ceiling that the early Christian churches would have had, and all the walls are lavishly decorated with frescoes. In every single surface that they've chipped off of here, but every surface is covered with frescoes. You can't see it so well in this painting, but let's take a look at this one. Can you see that every surface in the room is covered with frescoes, and there's stories from the Old and New Testament and stories from the time of this period of the kings and the queens and the bishops and the monks who live in this church. And maybe we'll zoom out to get the whole thing there. Okay. So you can see the church in its entirety, and you see every single surface, even the inside of the arches. All the walls are covered with these magnificent frescoes, and you have to take my word for it that they're magnificent. I'm going to try to show you some close up. Okay. Here are some more of those frescoes. Okay. I'll just try to zoom in a bit and see if we can. Here's a crucifix. Okay. So this portion is telling the story of the crucifixion of Christ, and here we have the three Marys at the tomb. The three Marys at the tomb, the crucifix. Christ being alive on the cross, by the way. He's not shown as dead, but alive. And then here we have the resurrection. And so we have the whole story of the New Testament there in that scene. And you can see how brilliant these colors must have been originally. Let's see if I can focus it a little better. Okay. And see how beautiful these pictures would have been. All right, let's zoom out again. And here, maybe we can get a closer look at that particular fresco, the crucifixion again. move it over to the Three Marys. Okay. This is the Christ Pantocrator, which is a classic Byzantine image that's over the apse. And here it is at St. Angelo in Formis, Christ Pantocrator with the pose. It's very Byzantine. This is a very Byzantine image, and the Byzantines always show him this way in the churches. And here it is, this Byzantine image. And when we look at the churches, I hope I'm going to have pictures of the masterpieces of Norman art in Sicily at Monreale and the Cappella Palatina. I'm not sure how those pictures came out. I have my fingers crossed. But we'll see this very same image of Christ Pantocrator in those churches, but instead of being frescoes, paintings on the wall, they will be brilliant golden mosaics, and we'll see that in those. Okay, and so we'll just get up real close and see how beautiful that picture is. Let's look at his face. This is a classic Byzantine image of Christ Pantocrator. And maybe we can move it down and look at him. This is just a classic image, and see the angels around him. But these are frescoes. They're paintings on the wall. And they're done in wet plaster. Later on, I'm going to argue, these very same images are going to appear in the mosaics that we then find in these glorious Byzantine mosaics in Sicily. Okay, now here again we have more of the wall paintings, and maybe we'll zoom in on those to see if we recognize any of the stories. Okay. Any ideas what these are? Yes, good. So this is the life of Jesus, and there he is walking on water, and he's talking to the fishermen, and they're seeing him. Okay, maybe we can move a little above and see. Anybody identify what these are? They're kind of hard.
The bottom left looks to be him raising Lazarus.
Raising Lazarus, okay. Your guess is as good as mine. All right, let's zoom out and then see. I mean, you can see how magnificent these are, and they're all biblical stories. And let's take a look at this one. I have some others that are kind of closer. This one we might be able to see a little better. I'm not sure what that one is. Let's see if we can get the one next to it. This is, I wonder if that's Christ carrying his cross. Is that what it looks like? Not really. What does it look like to you? You think he might be...
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Judas is betraying him with a kiss. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. That's it. So then the one next to it, I think over here, is probably going to be Pilate. Yeah, but someone is washing his feet. Jesus is definitely the one with the halo.
What's an episode where
You want to press your mic? Yeah.
where someone washed his feet and then anointed him,
Yeah.
and they bawled them out for wasting all that money.
Right, with the oil and the ointment, and he rebuked the disciples for rebuking those who washed his feet. Yeah.
Well, if you look, it does look like I believe Mary of Magdalene dried his feet with her hair.
Yes.
And it looks like in the picture, the figure on the right kneeling at his feet looks to be pulling her hair over her shoulder.
It does look
and
like
drying
that.
his feet with them.
That could very well be that episode. Yeah, but you see the enormous amount of detail. I mean, this illustrates the detail in which the life of Christ is shown. Unfortunately, I've only got New Testament episodes. I hope I've got an Old Testament one somewhere. Here is a bishop carrying a sign of some kind. I can't tell what it says. The frescoes, I mean, they're in remarkable condition. I mean, this church is just magical to stand in here with all this art around you. But frescoes are quite delicate. You know, they don't last very well. It is just miraculous that this church has survived.
Do any of the churches have relics?
Oh, yeah, lots of them do. Yeah, I didn't bring any reliquaries. I'll show you some next time, though. I have some reliquaries. Here's one I think that we can see maybe a lot better. Okay. What have we got here? Any guesses what this is? Kind of hard to figure out.
I don't know, but somebody appears to be smiting something.
Yeah. I can't tell what it is. I think this might be Old Testament. Very difficult to tell. Let's look at the bottom one. Maybe this is someone being tortured on a wheel.
A thought about the upper image. It would perhaps be Cain and Abel, since
Cain
you
and
have
Abel,
the
yes.
the person smiting. Then the next image, I can't make out what's above him to the right, but then he's somewhat twisted as if a mark had been put upon him, and he's speaking to a hand coming down from heaven.
Yeah, there's a hand coming down from heaven there. And he is kind of twisted. That could be Cain and Abel. Yeah, that could be Cain and Abel. The other one, I have no idea. That very well could be.
Wasn't there something about Ezekiel seeing a wheel or something like that?
Could that possibly be it? But somebody's being tortured on that wheel. And here are other wheels. Maybe it's Ezekiel in the wheel. Here, let's see. Somebody's doing something to their enemies here.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you can see how vivid these are, but they're hard to interpret. And here is the back of the church, and you can see all of the images. Let me zoom out on that. Here you can see the back of the church, and you can see every inch of it is covered with images, except here where it's kind of faded away there, and over here they've broken away. But every inch of this church is covered with images, and it's just unbelievably extraordinary. And you know, in art history books, I never see the interior of this church done they always show the Christ Pantocrator, or they might show Abbot Desiderius, which I've already shown you from this church, but nobody ever shows the whole program. Somebody needs to write a whole book about this church. Any graduate students volunteer? Yeah.
Well, it is rather incredible that so much that these small churches get covered, because fresco is extremely time consuming, because you have to lay that paint on while the fresco is fresh. But maybe that's why it lasts, because it sinks into the wet fresco and like sinks into the plaster and doesn't chip as easily.
And you know what is so remarkable about this church is so many of these Italian churches have been ruined because they go in and they restored them in the 17th century and they just destroy them. And this church is almost as fresh as the day it was created. I mean, it's faded a lot, and you have to stand there and look at it, very intently to figure out what they are. Even with these pictures, we've had to look very intently to figure out what the program is. But when you look at the pictures one after another, you can see, well, this is the Old Testament, and they're telling these various stories, and they're going on. And then you can clearly see the New Testament with the crucifixion and Pilate and the story of Jesus' life and death. And you can read those designs. But when you think of the Middle Ages, and when ordinary people, not just peasants, but also aristocrats who lived a life of simplicity, basically a rural life on the farm, to walk into this church, it would have a just riveting effect on them to see this beautiful art in this massive space. And this is quite a small church by the standards of Gothic cathedrals, but by the standards of the day in which it was built, it was magnificent and it was huge. And to see it remaining in such wonderful condition is quite amazing. But it's my theory that this church, St. Angelo in Forma, served as a model for the succeeding churches. I have just one little element more to show you, and these are the mosaic floors of the church which still remain. And these are beautiful mosaic floors. We might zoom in a little bit on that. And I picked 3 different examples of the mosaics. This is a kind of tree of life. I don't know if you can tell that. Maybe I'll zoom out on it. It's a tree. It's a tree of life. There's the stem of the tree, and here are the branches going up. And on this mosaic floor, which I thought was pretty extraordinary. Not only the walls, but the floor is completely covered with symbols and objects. Yeah.
Well, the design itself isn't quite as surprising, although I didn't know it had carried over into Christianity, because the Jews in their Kabbalistic system have the Tree of Life.
Oh, the Tree of Life is a very big image in Christianity, yes. It's an Old Testament image that they go back to, that is constantly referred to. So you would read both the Old Testament and the New equally in the programs in these churches. So this would be the Tree of Life that would be in the floor. And then here is a more prosaic kind of mosaic floor. Again, this looks quite Islamic, doesn't it? Doesn't it seem like a very Islamic design? So, yeah, another question.
Might the seeming Islamic influences be Byzantines because of the iconoclasm controversy, where they adopted Islamic art styles because they avoided icons?
They could easily be, and of course Islam and Byzantine art styles, Islamic art styles of course originated in Persian art styles, and then those blended together with Byzantines. There's overlay and overlay and overlay of culture going on here, and so it's difficult to isolate which are the origins of any of these different things. Yeah, comment.
And Sicily had been Muslim from early 10th century, is it?
No, it was earlier than the 10th century. I believe it was the 9th century that Sicily was conquered. But this isn't in Sicily. This is in Italy. So this would have been, probably it would have been built during the time when Roger the Great Count unified Italy and Sicily. And so this is when this church may well have been built. But no, this particular church was built way before that. I'm sorry, I correct myself there, because Abbot Desiderius built this church in the 1050s, actually. So this is in the midst of the Norman period. I mean, this is a very Norman church. Yeah.
That particular floor mosaic is somewhat reminiscent of photographs I've seen of floor mosaics at Pompeii.
Oh, no, that's interesting. Okay, I didn't think to get some comparisons with Pompeii. The Romans did magnificent floors. The floors the Romans did, and I may be able to put my hands on one for you to see, but the floors the Romans did were more pictures. They would usually have a border that would be something like this. You're right, there are similarities, but then overall, the overall pattern is much more patternized and more medieval than it is Roman. But here we see what the Normans are doing in Italy, and apparently they're tearing down all the old churches, or there weren't any old churches, and they're immersed in this just incredible building campaign, building many, many churches in every city, building cathedrals, building castles over all the cities, and so we have a magnificent building program. Okay, it's time to take our break now, and when we come back we're going to continue tracing the conquest of Italy and Sicily, and we'll see some of the later art that the Normans did about 50 years later, and we'll take your question after the break. Okay?